It was the third week of February 1974 when Tom and Della Pruitt drove their borrowed stock trailer back through the gate of their Blanco County property with 31 of the ugliest cattle anyone in that part of Texas had seen assembled in one place. The animals were thin in the way that tells you something about where they came from and what they had been asked to endure. Long-legged, narrow through the hip, their horns spreading wide and low in the particular geometry that made other ranchers in the hill country shake their heads and look away. Not the blocky Hereford crosses that grazed the surrounding ranches in well-fed contentment. Not the commercial Angus that brought reliable prices at the Kerrville sale barn. These were Texas Longhorns, old-line animals from a dispersal up near Menard. A rancher named Hicks had been running them on rough cedar country for 30 years, and when he died, his sons wanted them gone, fast, and cheap. Tom had raised his hand at $42 a head. The laughter at the sale barn had been the easy, comfortable kind, the kind that comes from people who know something and enjoy knowing it in front of someone who apparently does not. Bobby Crane, who ran 400 Herefords on his family's place south of Blanco, had leaned over to a man named Walt Shelby and said something that made Walt's shoulders shake. A few others along the rail had caught the joke without needing to hear it. It traveled the way those things travel in small sale barns, quietly and completely. Tom had heard it. He had the particular quality of a man who hears everything and responds to very little. He was 36 years old, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that had been outside in Texas weather long enough to look older than it was. He had grown up on a ranch 2 counties over, left for the oil patch at 19, come back at 32 with enough saved to put a down payment on 180 acres of cedar and limestone above the Pedernales that nobody else had wanted because the grass was thin and the water was unreliable, and the previous owner had run it harder than the land could sustain. Della had grown up differently. Her father had been a county agricultural extension agent in Mason County for 27 years. She had spent her childhood in the passenger seat of his truck, driving from one struggling ranch to another, watching him explain things to men who were too proud to have called him and too desperate not to. She had absorbed from those years a particular way of looking at land and animals, not what they appeared to be, what they were actually doing. She had been the one who found the Hicks cattle in the sale listings. She had driven up to Menard 2 weeks before the auction and walked through them in the cedar pasture where they had been running. She had watched them for 2 hours without saying much. Then she had called Tom from a payphone outside the feed store in town. "They are not sick," she had said. "They are built for something." He had driven up the following weekend. He had walked through them himself. He had looked at their feet, their legs, the condition of their eyes. He had looked at the country they had been living in, rocky and dry and unforgiving, and understood that an animal shaped by 30 years of that country carried something in its bones that you could not buy at a feedlot. "What are they built for?" he had asked her. "Surviving what is coming," she had said. He had not asked what she meant. He had learned in 4 years of marriage that when Della said something like that, she had already done the thinking that most people never got around to starting. What was coming, though neither of them knew the exact shape of it yet, was the drought of 1974. It would arrive in hill country that summer with the patience of something that had always been on its way and had simply been waiting for the right moment. It would be the kind of drought that separated the ranches that had been managed from the ones that had been mined. But that was still months ahead. In February, the grass was thin but present, and the neighbors were still laughing. Bobby Crane stopped by on a Saturday morning 3 days after the Pruitts brought the cattle home. He drove up in his truck with the easy confidence of a man paying a social call who also intended to deliver an education. He leaned on the fence and looked at the 31 Longhorns moving through the near pasture and was quiet for what he clearly considered a polite amount of time. 31 head, he said finally. "That is right," Tom said. "Longhorns," Bobby said. The word carried everything it needed to carry. "That is right," Tom said again. Bobby turned his hat in his hands. "Now, Tom, I'm not here to tell you your business, but those animals," he paused, looking for the charitable phrasing, "they're not going to perform the way you need them to perform, not on this ground. You need something that will put on weight reliably, something the market wants to see. What you've got there is a museum piece." Della had come out of the house and was standing at the fence beside Tom. She did not say anything. She looked at the cattle the way she always looked at things she was still learning from. Bobby looked at her, then back at Tom. I'm just saying, as a neighbor, you paid good money for a problem." Tom nodded once. "We appreciate you stopping by, Bobby." Bobby drove off down the Caliche Road, trailing a plume of white dust. Tom watched him go. Della watched the cattle. That evening, Walt Shelby called on the telephone. Then a man named Price Alderman, whom Tom barely knew, called to ask how the new cattle were settling in with the particular tone of someone who already knew the answer and found it instructive. By the end of the week, the Pruitt purchase had completed its circuit of the local conversation and arrived at the general conclusion that Tom and Della were either ignorant or stubborn, and probably both. They were neither, but they were quiet about what they knew, in the way that people are quiet when they understand that explaining themselves to the wrong audience is a waste of the time they need for the work. Now, let me tell you something about the Texas Longhorn that the ranching community of Blanco County in 1974 had largely chosen to forget. The Longhorn is one of the oldest cattle breeds in North America. It descends from animals the Spanish brought to the continent in the 1500s, cattle that had already been shaped by the harsh, dry country of the Iberian Peninsula before they ever set foot on American soil. For 3 centuries, they ran essentially wild across the grasslands of Texas and northern Mexico, surviving droughts and floods and the particular cruelty of a country that gives you everything and nothing in alternating seasons. What emerged from those centuries was not an animal that had been managed into resilience. It was an animal that resilience had built from the inside out. A mature Longhorn cow weighs significantly less than a commercial Hereford or Angus. That fact, which Bobby Crane had stated as a criticism, was in Della's accounting a feature of profound importance. In a drought year, the carrying capacity of a pasture is determined not by how many animals you can fit on it in a good year, but by how many animals the land can sustain when the grass stops growing. A smaller animal needs less. In degraded range in a dry year, that arithmetic is not a minor consideration. It is the difference between a ranch that survives and one that does not. The Longhorn's digestive system is also adapted to extract nutrition from coarser, lower-quality forage that commercial breeds leave behind or refuse entirely. Where a Hereford needs good grass, the Longhorn will work the cedar grass and the needle grass and the rough browse along the fence lines and turn it into body condition with a quiet efficiency that looks like stubbornness but is actually sophisticated biology developed over 300 years of necessity. Their feet are hard. Their legs are sound. They walk further to water than commercial breeds without losing condition. They calve without assistance with a frequency that makes commercial operations look expensive by comparison. They carry a disease resistance that comes from the same long selection that gave them everything else. Della had read all of this in her father's extension bulletins and in the range management literature she had been collecting since college. But she had not bought the cattle because of what she had read. She had bought them because of what she had seen in that cedar pasture in Menard. The way they moved across rough ground, the quality of their feet, the condition of their eyes, the particular alertness of animals that had learned to pay attention to their environment because their environment had never allowed them not to. She had seen the drought coming not in a weather report, but in the grass. The spring of 1974 had been dry in a way that people who watched land carefully recognized before the almanac did. The soil was not holding moisture the way it should. The root systems in the overgrazed pastures of the surrounding ranches were shallow, stressed, already compromised. A prolonged dry period would not just stop the grass from growing, it would kill the root systems entirely and leave the land unable to recover for years. The Pruitts ran their 31 Longhorns on a 4-paddock rotation that Della had planned on graph paper the winter before they bought the cattle. Each paddock rested for 6 to 8 weeks between grazings. The cattle moved through them on a schedule that was adjusted based on what the grass was actually doing, rather than what the calendar said it should be doing. Della walked the paddocks every morning with the same notebook her father had used on his county rounds, recording what she saw: growth rates, ground cover percentages, the condition of the soil at the surface, the behavior of the cattle at the paddock boundaries. Tom built fence. He repaired the stock tank that the previous owner had let silt up. He drilled a second water point in the back paddock so the cattle were not walking the full length of the property to drink and degrading the grass around the primary tank. He worked with the methodical patience of a man who had learned in the oil patch that the work that kept a thing from breaking was always cheaper than the work of fixing it after it broke. The neighbors drove past on the county road and looked at the thin cattle on the thin grass and arrived at the conclusion they had already reached the sale barn and saw no reason to revise. Then summer came. By July, the creek that ran through the east end of the property had dropped to a series of disconnected pools. The grass on the surrounding ranches had stopped growing in June, and the ranchers were feeding hay they had not planned to feed this early, and watching the price of hay climb every week as everyone in the county reached for the same dwindling supply. Bobby Crane sold 40 head in the first week of August, not because he wanted to, because the feed math had stopped working. At the Pruitt's place, the rotation was tighter now. Della had shortened the grazing periods and lengthened the rest periods as the drought pressed down. The grass was not lush, it was never lush on that limestone country, but it was present. The root systems in the rested paddocks had gone deep in the wet years and were drawing moisture now from below the surface layer that had dried to dust. The Longhorns grazed with the unhurried efficiency of animals that had been doing this for 300 years and understood at a cellular level that slow and thorough was the only pace that made sense on dry range. Their condition held. It was not show condition, it was working condition, the kind that a rancher who knows what they're looking at recognizes as something different from what the sale barn crowd calls good. In the third week of August, Walt Shelby lost 20% of his grass to hardpan. The ground had dried and crusted in a way that would take years in proper management to fully reverse. He drove past the Pruitt place on a Tuesday afternoon and slowed his truck on the county road and looked at the cattle for a long time before he drove on. Tom saw him from the barn. He did not wave. He went back to the water line he was repairing. Della had been awake since 4 that morning. She had been awake since 4 most mornings since June, because the drought had the particular quality of a problem that did not allow you to stop thinking about it. She sat at the kitchen table before sunrise with her notebook and her father's extension bulletins and the grazing records she had been keeping since February, and she ran the numbers forward, and they held. Tighter than she wanted, but they held. One morning in late August, Tom came in from the pre-dawn check and stood at the kitchen window without speaking for long enough that Della looked up from her notebook. "Prentice lost his well," he said finally. She was quiet for a moment. "How many?" 260. She looked back at her notebook. The numbers she had been running told her they had enough water for their 31 head through October if the cistern held and the stock tank did not drop below the inlet. Beyond October, she didn't know. Nobody knew what beyond October looked like yet. Tom poured his coffee and stood at the window. The light was coming up gray and thin over the Cedar Ridge to the east. "Survival begins long before the trouble arrives," he said. It was something Della's father had said once on one of those county road drives when she was 12, and she had told it to Tom the week they signed the papers on the property, and he had carried it since. She looked at him. "I know," she said. He turned from the window. "What do you need me to do today?" She told him. He went and did it. The drought broke in late September with 3 days of slow, soaking rain that the land received with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time and knew better than to rush. The creek came back, not to its full summer volume, but enough. The grass and the rested paddocks responded within 2 weeks. The root systems that Della's rotation had kept alive through the worst of it began sending up new growth that was thin at first and then steadier, and then by November present enough that the cattle were grazing again on live grass rather than dry standing forage. The Hereford operations around them recovered more slowly. The hardpan ground needed working. The overgrazed pastures needed rest they had not been given. Bobby Crane restocked in October at prices that were significantly higher than what he had sold at in August, and the arithmetic of that transaction would follow his operation for 2 years. At the Kerrville sale barn that November, the Pruitt calves went through at prices that surprised the buyers. The Longhorn cross calves were smaller than the Hereford calves in the adjacent pen, but they were sound and healthy, and the buyers who had been ranching through the drought recognized something in the condition of those animals that the ones who had not been watching closely did not yet understand. Bobby Crane came by on a Saturday in December. He stood at the fence and looked at the cattle for a long time without saying anything. The 31 Longhorns were grazing the south paddock in the thin winter light. Their horns caught the low afternoon sun, and for a moment the whole herd had the quality of something from a different century. "I had you wrong," Bobby said finally. He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying for a while and has decided the carrying is no longer worth what it costs. I thought you did not know what country you were in. Turns out I didn't know what year I was in. Tom leaned on the fence beside him. You came with a motor housing when we needed one, he said. That's what I remember. Bobby looked at him. Third week of August, Tom said. Water pump. You were at our gate in an hour. Bobby was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cattle. Good animals, he said finally. Not what I would have bought, but good animals. He came back in January with 2 younger ranchers who had questions. Della walked them through the rotation system and the breed selection and the water management with the plain, unhurried patience of someone sharing information rather than winning an argument. None of this is new, she told them. It is documented range science. It is just not what most people around here have been doing. They asked questions. She answered them. They went home with their father's extension bulletins photocopied on the machine at the county library, and their own notebooks started. The Morse Creek pastures, as the neighbors called the Pruitt place without quite meaning to use its name, began greening 2 weeks ahead of the surrounding ranches the following spring. The root systems had hennelled through the drought, and the spring rain found them ready. The soil on the lested paddocks pulled the moisture down and held it in the way that soil with intact structure does, slowly and deep against the dry months that would come again, because they always came again in that country. Tom added a 3rd water catchment that spring. Della kept her grazing log. The 31 cattle that Bobby Crane had called a museum piece grazed the limestone slope in the long afternoon light, their calves close, the creek running clean below them. The land had tested them. They had been ready. And the neighbors who had laughed at the sale barn in February were the first ones through the gate in December asking how. Survival begins long before the trouble arrives. Tom and Della Pruitt had believed that when no one around them did. They had built for it when the grass was still green and the creek was still running, and there was no visible reason that anyone watching from the county road would have understood. The land, as it always does for those who listen carefully enough, remembered.